Welcome to the Dairy News and Views podcast, a production of the Iowa State University Extension and Outreach Dairy Team. Our podcast covers current educational, research, and industry tools available for your operation to manage healthy cows and calves while producing the highest quality dairy products. Thanks for joining us today on Dairy News and Views from the ISU Dairy Team. I'm Jen Bentley, Northeast Iowa Dairy Field Specialist, and I'm here today with my dairy colleagues, Fred Hall, our Northwest Iowa Dairy Field Specialist, and Dr. Larry Tranel, Northeast and Southeast Dairy Field Specialist, as we discuss today's topic. So welcome back to the podcast, Fred and Larry.
Good to be here.
Always glad to be part of it.
Well, and today's topic of discussion is focused around mental health and farmers' personalities. May is Mental Health Awareness Month, and in recent years, our dairy team has really emphasized more of our resources and programming around mental health of our dairy producers. And Larry, your background and education is in psychology, and you've been assisting our farm families for many years in an extension through communicating, transitioning, and overall farm planning. So Larry, how has mental health of our dairy farmers changed?
I think I'd first start with our 2021 Iowa Dairy Survey we did, where it showed that 50% of Iowa dairy farmers reported that their mental health either being much worse or much worse compared to just 5 years ago. So milk prices have gone up in 2022. So I'm thinking I'm seeing more smiles or maybe just sighs of relief as compared to 2016 to 2021, when we had 5 to 6 years of some very tough times for dairy farmers. And it was only worsened in those last 2 years by COVID, but at least not as price related as in the past. But now we have this thing called inflation that's really inflating our costs of inputs like feed, fuel, and fertilizer, and they've just skyrocketed. And so it may not have lessened, but I think it maybe have changed in its base causes.
Larry, you mentioned inflation rates related to farm input costs, but these inflation rates are also directly impacting farm family household inputs like food costs, utilities, fuel. How does this impact farm-family relationships?
Well, Fred, we know that there's a very high correlation to financial stress and marriage success. And so as the marriage goes, so often goes the rest of family relationships. They just kind of follow in that with that stress. So just yesterday, it took me about $70 to fill up 3 gas cans for my lawnmower. I couldn't believe it. You know, filling up a small car nowadays is over $50, and some of our bigger trucks are well over $100 just to fill with gas. So you take a look at eggs and other food products. I mean, it's really shrunk the food dollar. And so this inflation has a heavy impact on family budgets and assumingly their family relationships as well as these budgets tighten. And when budgets tighten, we know that emotions fly higher, trying to deal with it all. It affects those relationships.
That's definitely true, Larry. And, you've been keeping up with a lot of the research in mental health. So what's new with your farmer mental health in your programs and presentations this past year?
Well, I think simple knowledge of how dairy farmers' personalities, I guess I'm kind of a personality junkie, and I really starting to realize how much this impacts their mental health and plays into it. So for some people, their personality can really help them manage and downplay the effects of stress. But for others, their personality might be pretty significant as a source in the impact of stress and how it relates to their life. So we realize that farmers are definitely a very resilient bunch compared to the rest of the society. They're more financially and stress resilient, probably because they grew up with so many more challenges. And if they made it through this far, I mean, seriously, a lot of these farmers could be part of a survivor series if there was such a thing for dairy farmers. I say that with a smile on my face.
What do you even mean by personality, as it can have a direct meaning to different people?
Glad you asked the question, Fred, because personality traits, we typically define them as patterns of thoughts, patterns of feelings, and behaviors that persist from one decision situation to another. So an individual's personality, sometimes we say they're born with it, but they're often formed in early stages of life. And when we take a look at, they're actually quite stable over, through adulthood. So studies will show that personality traits affect almost every aspect, if you can believe it, of an individual's decision-making and their behavior. So personality traits, we know that they're measurable, so we can actually test the personality tendencies of people, which can assist us in assessing their personalities for trying to increase their understanding among farm families of who they are and how they prefer to do things. So with that, a dairy farmer's personality is hypothesized to play a very significant role in their reaction to stress, their resiliency in stress, and also their success in life. So personality can influence the stress process and also those stress outcomes. So generally, people believe that the link is stronger than research actually bears to be the case. But it really, for certain people, I think the link is actually quite strong. And the strongest link is for the influence of neuroticism, which we term as negative emotion, on evoking negative stress outcomes.
Larry, can you give us some specifics of personality traits as it relates to farmers?
Yeah, there's quite a few of them. And so in the last year or two, I tried to make a pyramid of farm personality traits so I could better understand it myself and tried to work with it in some of the works that I have. And these are specific traits that have been researched as related to farm stress or farm success. And the first trait that tops the scale is people's locus of control, which can be internal or external. But for most people, it's probably somewhere in the middle. So for farmers with a higher internal locus of control, they kind of take charge with their own initiative and they move to improve more. They search for more income opportunities, as example, and they also seek solutions from a larger area. So people that have an external locus of control, which means that initiatives often comes from outside themselves. So for people with external locus of control, they tend to have the initiative actually comes from outside themselves. So they will move and they will seek and search solutions less. So we also realize that a person's locus of control is highly related to some other traits such as proactivity, reactivity, and passivity. So proactive people take initiative when others do not, and they persist in improving their environment and themselves. Proactivity has been linked to leadership, sales performance, personal achievements, entrepreneurship. So we realize that both objective and subjective career success are also associated with a proactive personality, which is that internal locus of control. So we can extrapolate that to its opposite as well for some reactive and passive personality traits.
We often hear the term introvert or extrovert. Is that related to stress and mental health?
Yeah, I would say quite heavily as well. And so it's a personality trait that tends to relate to somebody that's more introspective versus sociability. So in social situations, extrovert and introvert personalities, they display very different behaviors. So extroverts show a preference for seeking and engaging in and enjoying social interactions, where people that tend to be heavy introverts tend to be reserved and withdrawn social settings and often preferring to avoid social situations together. So I'm talking about the people that are the ends of the spectrum, but a lot of us are kind of more of an ambi in the middle of it. We call them ambiverts. We realize that even though introverts tend to be quieter, gaining enjoyment from spending time alone, extroverts are more socially present. They thrive in the energy of those around them and often find themselves in the center of attention in large social groups if they're high on the end of the spectrum here. So it's definitely not an either or type, as the majority of people would actually tend to have a more balanced percentages of the type somewhere in the middle, and they can very comfortably adapt to both ends of the spectrum, at least for short periods of time. So again, those people in the middle, we tend to call them ambiverts.
So generally speaking, Larry, do you find farmers to be more introverted or extroverted? And if they're introverted or extroverted, how does this affect how they work with their family, maybe the employees that they hire, or just overall general management of their farming operation?
So yeah, Jen, research will show that farmers in general, rural people tend to be more introverted, but often they're married to spouses. So that farm woman might be more extroverted. So if the introverted male is the manager, they might have even smaller herd sizes on their dairy farm, as they don't like to be a people manager. And if they have to manage people, they'd probably do it in a more hands-off approach, more of a quieter approach, I would guess. But the important part is, like, when we get into time-pressured situations, introverts are more likely to use that early information that they had to form judgments and make decisions than extroverts would in that same context. And so the introverts tend to be a little more indecisive, but research into the impact of extroversion, introversion on decision making suggests to us that extroverts make more snap decision based on what feels more natural at the moment, while introverts were found to exhibit quality checking behaviors before making decisions. So there's also a need for someone to steer them in the right direction when they're faced important decisions. We're talking about the extroverts here. So conversely, introverts avoid impulsive decisions through thoughtful consideration, through their intuition, and primarily count on themselves. Introversion versus the extroversion traits can also impact farm stress, as the more introverted tend to be more inhibited in talking or just taking action on issues. So in the workplace, and I'm not just talking about farmers here, extroverts generally hold more positive valuations of life in general, and their careers, their farming careers are no exception. So research has shown positive associations between extroversion and career satisfaction. So add up to that, extroverts are more likely to take action in order to remedy unsatisfactory workplace situations than their introverted counterparts. All in all, it definitely plays into the farm stress, I think, in the workplace, whether you're introverted or extroverted.
You have a personality box test that considers 4 personality types. What are they and what application do they have?
So as I mentioned before, Fred, personalities are defined as patterns of thoughts, feelings, and behaviors that persist from one situation to another. So a majority of personality models and tests that are out there that people can use, they use a 4-trait theory. Okay, so not counting on the introversion and extroversion. So that personality box model is being used as a sample model that has proven very successful in working with our farmers. And the 4 traits of thinking and feeling and the behaviors broken down into ordering and doing. These are all very common traits that are labeled in various ways in people's 4-trait theories. So thinking and feeling are each traits that are intertwined with our behaviors of ordering and doing. And so people tend to have 1 or 2 go-to traits, if you will, in the way that they prefer to do things. So we can look at a couple different models in this 4-trait theory for comparison.
So Larry, how is the feeler more prone to farm stress?
So I would tend to say that the feeler person is more prone to farm stress because they're associated with higher levels of anxiety and depression. And they also tend to have more emotional attachment to the farm as more of than a business, but it's more of a way of life. And it impacts their decision-making as well. And that feeler type may also be more deeply engrossed in emotional reaction and wallow in negative emotions, the situations and people related to the farm and the family business and their involvement with that. So we realize also that the feelers also may tend to play the blame game emotionally with themselves, that a farm failure or some kind of a financial failure, that it's their fault. And thus they allow themselves to kind of wallow in these negative emotions, whether it be shame, guilt, despair, whatever.
How is the thinker more prone to farm stress, Larry?
I would think the thinker personality, Fred, might be more a person that's, constantly questioning this option or that option or this solution or that solution with a desire to always needing to make the best decision. And though they did not get the decision made in time because they're still thinking about it, that can greatly add to stress. So indecisiveness for wanting to make a second-rate decision, for not wanting to make a second-rate decision can cause the better decision sometimes not to be made. So one business that has said at one point decided to hire these engineering type or these thinker type personalities, everybody that's very creative, but they didn't always see things through to completion. But instead, they started thinking about other things that they create. So those thinkers are very creative type people. So just keeping their thoughts above their emotions is very paramount for this thinker personality. And so if farm stress causes high emotional reaction, that might only add to the stress for this personality type.
And how does the orderer become more prone to farm stress?
So that orderer personality, when things don't go according to plan, or harvest isn't done according to on a very timely basis or not a good quality, because for the orderer, everything has a time and everything has a place. And that personality, when things get disordered or out of place, it creates chaos in the mind of the server. So the server tends to also be somewhat controlling and kind of in charge of people, that I talk, you listen type attitude. And if low milk prices cause things to get out of control, or anything causes people to get out of order, sometimes a heavy emotional price might be paid for this orderer personality.
Finally, how is the doer more prone to farm stress?
I would tend to say the doer is probably more prone to farm stress because of their kind of an impulse personality. They fly by the seat of their pants approach and managing possibly the details of the farm. So simply not creating plans or just going day by day without a longer term focus or short-term detail can cause distress of serious magnitude over time. And so the doer can thoroughly enjoy the physical work. They love working with their hands and all the excitement of the farm, the high level of management, but attention to detail is often not the doer's strong suit. So the learned skills of filing and making lists and budgeting and planning and goal setting, etc., they may need to be learned, and it makes them out of step with their natural tendencies. So that might cause stress, but they need to make these things more of a habit because they do not come natural, but they're very necessary to the success of the farm. And so I would tend to say that bottom line is all four of these personality types could be quite susceptible to farm stress, but the feelers, with everything else being equal, probably feel the impact the most and might wallow in that, and especially if they're also more of the introverted type. So I think simply knowing these first four personality types can actually help one become more dramatically resilient to farm distress and anxiety and depression. We don't want to box ourselves in, but there's definitely things we can do to understanding the personality box as it relates to managing farm relationships and reducing farm stress.
So Larry, you offered this during, our farm couple getaways here in the last couple of years. And I think it's just been a real eye opener for couples who come to this getaway, and really creates a lot of discussion and communication between those couples when they understand better what kind of personality type they're dealing with. And then also figuring out other family members, what kind of personality they are as well.
Yeah, I think it's important that, as they go through the personality test, there's nothing that will verify a personality test more than a spousal's rebuttal to their personality, because they tend to know them best and sometimes better than themselves.
So during the farm couples getaway, you also discussed the 5-trait model and farm distress resiliency. Talk a little bit more about that.
Yeah, so I think the 5-trait model, people that really want to dive into a more research-based one and just really want to dive into their personalities in a more in-depth way. So there's 5 traits, and each one of these traits can actually be broken down into 2 other traits, which actually give a total of 10. So I'll just go through these hopefully real quickly. The first one is extroversion, which is basically a person's enthusiasm and their assertiveness in life. And so this is a positive. It's a take charge trait that has dimension of both positive reaction and also proactive attitude in dealing with farm stress. So just keeping a person's head high, their shoulders straight, and a smile on the face, confidence in the mind, friendliness in the heart are practices to learn from, as it has neurological implications that kind of exude more positive hormone release in our bodies for more positive function. So the extroversion is on a Bell scale, and with this trait, introversion does not necessarily mean its opposite, is because this is kind of different than the introvert extrovert piece of it. This extroversion trait is just a kind of a person that tends to be very positive emotion, I guess I would tend to say, which is going to be the exact opposite of the neuroticism, which is actually the second trait that is based on 2 traits of volatility and withdrawal. And so neuroticism, we look at negative emotion. Extroversion, we look at a positive emotion. With neuroticism, it's more of a negative, and it's kind of a debilitating trait that has dimension of both fight and flight in dealing with farm stress. So whether it be uncertainty or fear of failure, loss of some security, just disgust of situations and relationships, it kind of gives propensity for negative emotion, which is possibly of high magnitude, needing both time and energy to kind of process the many negative possible outcomes that we need to kind of guard ourselves. So our negative mind has been built over millions of years trying to protect ourselves from predators, from, lots of things in life. It gets into our emotions. Our volatility might lead to higher hyper aggressive responses. So we realize also that negativity begets negativity, and it causes parties and relationships to put up their defenses. It can often strain relationships and maybe causing the other party to withdraw. So again, in marriage, neuroticism is a very heavy predictor of divorce. It's a predictor of failed relationships with children that can easily add to farm stress. And so this neuroticism trait, again, that all humans have to various degrees, really needs attending to, because I think this is the one that's probably the most destructive to farm relations and can also cause a lot of the farm stress. The third trait is called conscientiousness, and that's broken down into both industriousness and orderliness. And so this is kind of order over chaos type trait that is very key to life success. And next to IQ, trait is probably the second best predictor of life outcomes for success. And so not just in planning, but in carrying out plans. So that's using a kind of a think before one acts type of a mindset. And this trait's also heavily related to this word called disgust. And these people don't like pathogens in life. So they react heavily to this emotion of disgust, and they plan to act accordingly to get those negative things out of their life. So to conscientiously deal with farm distress and overcome disgust with industrious and orderliness to help resolve and develop goals, and then they see these things through, and this personality thing would actually tend to write these things down as well. So the last part of this, the two traits here, agreeableness and compassion. So agreeableness is broken into compassion and politeness. And this is kind of a negotiation stance personality trait, that how do you balance your needs and your wants of yourself relative to others, especially for farm women. They tend to be higher than men in compassion and politeness. So taking care of those farm needs and family needs, household needs, spouse needs, kids needs, they can often impact stress positively and negatively. And experience says that the element of margin of time plays into both success and failure in people's agreeableness and their politeness. So every time that we're pushed to get it all done, it impacts our time and our attitude for balancing needs and just, making the farm successful versus caring for family needs and things like that. So it plays into the, maintaining those senses of our courteousness, our urgency, timeliness, and balance. And so when you take a look at farm stress, those people that tend to have a lot of compassion and politeness, one of the problems they sometimes experience is that, things are happening on their farm, but they're too polite to actually, try to deal with it with somebody, or that might impact a relationship. And the last one I would tend to say is that openness to experience. And that's a personality trait that's broken down into openness and intellect. And so this is kind of that IQ and creative type trait dimension that accumulates knowledge and experience. And I would tend to say that some of our best farmers tend to be very high in this trait. So many farmers get stuck in the tradition, though, of how dad did it. And in the dairy industry, we realize that changes ever so fast. And so finding success responses, building on each success, and that releases dopamine to give us encouragement to overcome farm distress with the thought, even when it's bad, we should stay open to life itself and continually attain farm and family intellect and knowledge of how to try to run this farm. And so that experience piece of managing the farm is a pretty important piece of dealing with it, and can really try to overcome some of the distress that we experience in farms. So bottom line with all these traits and with this whole pyramid is that personality heavily impacts farm stress and distress.
Throughout today's discussion, we've used two terms, stress and distress. What do they mean and what's the difference?
Okay, so stress is anytime we react to something that it might be negative or we've got too much to do. Okay, so stress can actually be a positive thing in life. And so for us as human beings, probably would not want to live our life without stress. Okay, stress encourages us to do things. It creates us the ability and the desire to move from point A to point B. Okay, so it kind of unsettles us, makes us uncomfortable, and causes us to maybe improve our lives. So the problem with it is when you take a look at performance, is that people that tend to have a lot of, say, quite a bit of stress, they tend to perform higher, but that performance often is beyond what we can handle for stress. And once we have to perform beyond our stress comfort levels, that's the point where we start getting into distress. It's the distress part that we worry about. And so when we take a look at the stress, is that's when it causes people to, not be able to think clearly. They've got too much going on. They can't process that much information. Their emotions are running at a high level. It gets into their impact of their relationships. And so that's the distress that we worry about, not so much stress itself. In fact, there's a research project out there is that people that think stress is bad tend to have higher levels of distress. But for those people that don't think stress is bad, they weren't much different than a control group in their ability to deal with stress.
Well, Larry, you brought a lot of great information to our podcast here today, and we certainly appreciate all the work that you've done with our farm families, particularly our dairy producers. And I do want to note, I will put in the podcast notes a link to our stress resiliency page on our dairy extension team that has a lot of resources that you've developed over the last few years. We have a rural resiliency webinar series. There's a publication that goes through brain health and brain tactics, talking about behaviors, and a farmer's mental health toolbox. So lots of resources that people can dig into further. And so again, I really appreciate you being on the podcast. Any last or final thoughts as we conclude here today?
I just appreciate you having us on the podcast. It's always a pleasure to do it. And then just for everybody, whether they farm or not, or they're working with farmers, just to realize that mental health and personalities play into it. So whatever we can do to try to increase our own knowledge of people's personalities, I think can play into more success in trying to help people deal with it.
Well, thanks again. And thanks for joining us today. And we look forward to visiting with you on the next Dairy News and Views from ISU.
This institution is an equal opportunity provider. For the full non-discrimination statement or combination inquiries, go to www.isufdairy.org. www.extension.iastate.edu/diversity/ext.